Hi guys, Jack Caffrey here in Dublin's Liberties. Today we're going to be going on a tour of Dublin's oldest and most illustrious suburb. The Liberties is an area that situates itself just to the west of the old city walls of Dublin, and it's a very legendary area. It was founded initially indirectly as a result of the murder of Thomas à Becket in England. England invaded Ireland in 1169. The English arrived on the beach of Baginbun on the 1st of May 1169. Their military superiority ensured that within 15 months they were outside the gates of Dublin, and Dublin surrendered to the English on the 21st of September 1170. Now, Dublin surrendered to the English on the 21st of September 1170. Now, there were two things going on at this time. Obviously, some of Henry II's Norman generals had come over to Ireland and perhaps were intending to set up a separate kingdom. That has traditionally been the understanding. Perhaps that is a little bit wide of the mark. There was also something very important going on in England. That was the murder of Thomas à Becket. Thomas à Becket had been appointed by Henry II, Archbishop of Canterbury, and it had been fully expected, as was the norm at the time, that a bishop appointed by a king would simply do the bidding of that king. He wouldn't be a particularly religious or pious person. He would simply do the bidding of the king. Kings and queens in medieval Europe had a great say in the appointment of bishops and cardinals, but Thomas à Becket took his position rather seriously, and he felt he was there as a servant of God, not of the King of England, and he had a very quick falling out with Henry II. So ultimately, in a moment of frustration, Henry famously said, "Who will rid me of this meddlesome priest?" So some of his courtiers took that as a broad hint to head to Canterbury in Kent and to deal with the recalcitrant bishop. So 4 of Henry's knights, it is said, set off for Kent. Thomas à Becket had just finished saying Mass in Canterbury Cathedral. He heard there were 4 knights outside. He suspected what they were up to, and he chose not to come out of the cathedral once the ceremony was over. The knights, unbelievably, did what was completely taboo in the Middle Ages. They entered a church and they murdered a priest there within the 4 walls of his own church. This was a huge scandal at the time. Now, because Henry was a king, he wasn't excommunicated. However, he was placed under interdict, which meant it was the next thing to excommunication. He wasn't quite excommunicated, but he simply couldn't go to church. And of course, in those days, people had great qualms of conscience. People really did believe in a heaven up above them and a hell down below them. And Henry had real anxiety about his eternal welfare, about his spiritual consequences in the next life, the consequences of having had Thomas à Becket murdered, or at least of having incited his murder. So he had an idea. The interdict to which he'd been subjected in England didn't run in Ireland. His generals had recently set up in Ireland. So a year after the murder of Thomas à Becket, which had occurred in December 1170, barely 3 months after the taking of Dublin by the Normans, 1 year afterwards, he comes to Dublin and he attends church in Christchurch Cathedral. Not only that, he renames the ancient highway out of Dublin, which was called the Schleemore. It was the highway between Dublin and Galway. He renames it Thomas Street in honour of his deceased friend, sets up a monastery in honour of St. Thomas the Martyr, and endows that monastery with certain liberties to run their own court system, raise their own taxation systems and so forth, to have the rights of salvage and so forth. And because this particular district had these entitlements that were outside of the normal remit of the law, the area became known as a liberty. Now this set a worrying precedent, because subsequent kings and queens were put under pressure by religious orders to give similar liberties, similar entitlements to religious orders. They were urged to give similar entitlements to religious orders. So a network of semi-autonomous districts evolved to the west of the city walls, which are still known to this day as the Liberties. Now those legal entitlements fizzled out in the early 1840s. Nonetheless, they were very conducive to the expanding of business, and the area was considerably more wealthy than the rest of the city. It was outside of the city walls, which meant that many of the city laws simply didn't apply. City jurisdiction didn't apply, and people were able to be a little bit more prosperous and industrious and hardworking. So that's what happened. So I'm about to take you on a tour of the Liberties today, guys. So we'll just have a quick look around and just kind of turn the camera around, guys, so you can have a look in front of you. So this old street here, this is called Thomas Street nowadays, but this was the Schleemore, which in Old Gaelic means the Great Highway, which went between Dublin and the city of Galway. So this was the Schleemore. In 1170, when Henry II came over, he renamed it Thomas Street in honour of St. Thomas the Martyr, or Thomas à Becket, his his deceased friend. Interestingly, across the way there is a road just down the hill, which is called Keezer's Lane. It was called Keezer's Lane in old Dublin, and it was named after the Viking who was responsible for looking after the ships at the quays. He was called the Keezer. What you find is most towns on the east coast of Ireland have a street called Keezer's Lane or Keezer Street, which leads down to the quays, and which was basically the pathway that the Keezer would take, K-E-Y-S-E, nothing to do with a Kaiser. The Keezer would take that pathway down to the quays to supervise the mooring of ships and so forth. Now, over the centuries, Dubliners with their ribald sense of humour renamed the street, largely because the street was nothing more than a clay path. It got very muddy in the rain, and if you were traipsing up that very steep street in the rain and you managed to slip, your face might go smack into the backside of the person in front of you. So they renamed Keezer's Lane Kiss Arse Lane. So by the time the 1400s come around, quite humorously, you will see the maps of Dublin with the name Kiss Arse Lane, Kisse-A-R-S-E. That name supplanted the original Keezer's Lane. So something a little bit irreverent, but Dubliners are of that manner. Now, heading down Thomas Street now, and what you'll see on the right, guys, is something that is called the Fenian Church. You can see that is the church with the highest steeple in Dublin. The steeple is 200 feet high. And the reason it's called the Fenian Church is because it was building started on the church in 1862 at a time when a great many people of all social classes in Ireland were heavily involved in the struggle for independence. And many of these people were spending time in jail. And of course, when artists and sculptors were spending time in jail, their work had to cease, obviously. If they were working on a sculpture or a painting or whatever, that painting couldn't be continued by somebody else's hand, so they had to wait until these people got out of jail to continue their work in the church. So, of course, the church took quite a long time to build. It was started in 1862. It wasn't complete until 1915. So it's known as the Fenian Church because so many people who were involved in building the church and decorating it were involved in the Irish independence movement in the late 1800s. But before we go down to the Fenian Church itself, I just want to take you on a little saunter down Francis Street. That's this street here. And Francis Street is the street that Jonathan Swift uses as his address, as his fictional address, when he's writing his Draper's Letters in the early 1720s. Now, the Reformation was generally bad for Irish people in the sense that we became a Catholic enclave and trapped inside a Protestant entity. And of course, after the Reformation, Protestant countries discriminated against their Catholics, and likewise Catholic countries discriminated against their Protestants. So you had the ironic situation that Protestants in Catholic France had to flee in the late 1600s after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1684. Where did they come? Very many of them came to Dublin. And almost the entire weaving industry of northern France decamped to Dublin. They set up the weaving industry here, and very soon they were putting English weavers under pressure. English weavers are losing their markets, and they lobbied the House of Commons in London to do something about it. The House of Commons rather unsubtly brought in very heavy and punitive protectionist taxes on the Dublin economy, and many of these weavers in Dublin were very soon put out of business. And very quickly Jonathan Swift, who was the Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral, took up their cause, and he wrote the famous Draper's Letters from a fictional address in Francis Street addressing their plight. So Jonathan Swift perhaps marks that point in Irish history where people of English ancestry who've settled here begin to see themselves as Irish. So certainly where people weren't allowed to do business or propagate their professions, people had just cause certainly to take issue with what the London Parliament was doing. And of course Swift's famous dictum was burn everything English except their coal. In other words, break the connection with England, and of course wage economic warfare on them as well, insofar as they have waged economic warfare on the city of Dublin. Now we're just going to go a little bit down Francis Street to have a look at a rather special building down there that was built by the Guinness family. Let me show you. The Guinnesses have been Dublin's white knights over the past 150 years. Not all of the ascendancy families in Ireland were cold and unfeeling towards the less well off, and the Guinnesses are very much a case in point, although it might be pointed out that they initially originated from Old Gaelic stock. They were an Old Gaelic clan that converted to Protestantism in the Reformation in the hope of holding on to their ancestral lands, which of course they did. They dropped the Mac in their name. They became just known as the Guinnesses, but they didn't forget where they were from. And they were always very good employers to their staff here in Dublin. Now, rather uncharacteristically of employers, they built apartments for their workers in the early 1900s in Dublin. And while they were building those apartments, they needed to clear a trading area, which is just to the north of St. Patrick's Cathedral. And in doing that, obviously, they were displacing a certain amount of street traders. And in order to give them somewhere to carry on their business, they built this magnificent building here on the left called the Ivy Markets, or more correctly, the Iva Markets, because the traditional title of the Guinness family is they're the Earls of Iva. Now that's spelled I-V-E-A-G-H. Iva is in South County Down, which is just inside the border with Northern Ireland. So this rather unique piece of architecture was designed by a man called Edward Hicks in 1902. It was built over a 4-year period, between 1902 and 1906. So just have a quick look at it. It's a rather original structure. It has a dry market at the front, at this side, and at the back there was a wet market. So the wet market obviously was for the sale of vegetables and fruit. The dry market was for the sale of clothes and so forth. And very interestingly, they have sculptures of the various trading nations Dublin traded with over the centuries outside. So have a look. This is obviously, I suppose you could say, a Saracen or somebody from the Arab countries, or perhaps a Turk. The female figure here is Europa. So she represents, I suppose, continental Europe, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, those nations closest to Ireland with which there was quite a lot of trade going on. This gentleman here looks like, well, correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps a Moroccan or a Berber of North African extraction. And what you have here then in the dead century is you have Hibernia. So Ireland is personified as a female goddess called Hibernia. Now to the right here we have, I suppose what you could call a Spanish type. This gentleman might be seen as a Spaniard. There was always a great deal of trade going on between Ireland and Spain, more particularly between the ports on the west of the country, however, because you know, as early as the 13 or 1400s, the cities of Galway and Limerick were involved heavily in trade with northern Spain. And here we have a representation of, well, of course, North America. You have a Native American Indian here, you see, quite distinctively from the headgear. So this symbolizes trade with North America. And we have another person here. And again, this person looks like somebody, perhaps an Egyptian or somebody from the North African coast, maybe an Algerian or something like that. So not quite as easy to identify. But and then around the corner, there is a very quizzical personality. Let me show it to you. Around the corner, we have this person. Now, this guy is winking. So who do you think he is? Well, it is said that the face is actually a very good likeness of the Earl of Iva himself, the man who commissioned the building of this structure. So hence he is winking. So that is the Earl of Iva himself. Apparently he looked like that, perhaps not as bedraggled in his day, but that's the Earl of Iva. Now, this particular market fell into disuse in the 1980s. It became rather decrepit, and it was bought by a developer about 20 years ago on the basis that he would develop it into a public amenity and obviously rent it out to businesses and so forth. He hasn't done anything with it. A great deal of damage has resulted in the interior of the building, which will cost about 20 million euro to repair. And of course, what has happened, our white knight friends have swung into action again. The Guinness family have recently published a plan called A Market for Everyone, where they intend to take back the building, because there is a clause, a reverting clause, it is as it's called, in the contract of sale to the developer, saying that if the place isn't developed, the Guinnesses can take the place back. And that's what they're going to do, and they are going to implement their own plan. It's called A Market for Everyone, to develop this market and to bring it back to its pristine glory as the Iva market. So there you go, good news for the Liberties. Right, guys. Yes.
I'm very interested God.